the room. Please note that any audience contributions or questions may be captured on the broadcast recording. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Chris Lazzaro. Well, first, I met Chris recently at a conference, and we both have actually something in common in that Colleen has had the pleasure of working with both of us in correcting our errors and making us look like we can write better than we really can. So, Chris is the Director of Science Education at the College Board. He has been involved and directed AP redesign efforts. He has directed the development of the College Board standards. He has been a physics and chemistry and earth science teacher, and he is currently pursuing his doctorate at Columbia in science education and policy. So it is my pleasure to introduce Chris Lazzaro.
Hi, so I'm going to go through today, for the most part, the way in which we are kind of re-envisioning assessment and assessment models in science and science education. And there'll be, this is a small enough group, so as I'm going through this, if there are questions or if there's something that doesn't quite make sense, just interrupt me and we can kind of talk it out, because some of the stuff that we'll go through, I want to make sure that we all understand kind of what the differences are and kind of from the old questions to the new questions. So we're going to walk through some examples and we'll be able to talk, and so don't feel like you just have to sit there quietly. So, is there another way to do this?
That's just
Pointing at the screen or pointing at the phone?
I could use it. Is it here?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, well, that's not working either. Yeah. Okay, just move the mouse.
Good. Just one second.
Yeah, sure. You might be able to click on the screen too. Do we have this one?
I'll try.
Both of you, smart board. Okay, go ahead.
We'll see. We'll see how it goes. Okay. So the first question is probably why did the College Board go and redesign the advanced placement science courses, right? So they were making plenty of money. There was no real major push for us to do this, except back in 2002, the National Research Council issued a report. And the purpose of the report was to kind of talk about ways in which advanced study in math and science education can be improved in the United States. And one of the major criticisms that was levied by this report was on the AP Sciences assessments. And basically what they were saying is that these assessments are great. The problem is what you're calling rigor is just everything. So what we were covering was absolutely everything you could possibly cover in a 2-semester course, and then assessing students at the end of it and saying, this is a rigorous course. And what we weren't getting to was any of that depth of knowledge. Students were not necessarily able to actually use any of the science that they were using. And really what we were trying to do was provide them with a good science course, right? Something that would prepare them for college and that they could get college credit for. I'm sure probably some of you in the room have taken a few of these. So anybody that was actually in the room that has taken any of these, unless you took the biology one this past year, took the old assessment. So we're going to be looking at the newer assessments this year. So what did we do? Basically what we did is we took the entire course, each one of them, so there's AP Physics, Chemistry, Life Science, which is the biology piece, and Earth Science, Environmental Science. And we created these big ideas. Basically the big ideas became the organizational buckets that we put all of the content into. And what we wanted to do was try to narrow that scope. So rather than the mile-wide, inch-deep, we wanted to narrow the scope of the content, say that it's only organized around these big ideas. And then we looked at the enduring understanding. So then we wanted to unpack each one of those buckets into something that we would call enduring understandings or durable learning. Right? And I'll talk more about what each one of these components are in just a minute. And then to really address that idea of being able to use the science content knowledge, we wrote science practices. Now, this is not all that new, right? Like, this has been happening for many, many years. A lot of people have come up with this. We have just kind of reinvented the wheel here, except what we really kind of added to the conversation was looking at how we could merge these pieces all together. And so that's what we're going to go through now. So those are the three components: the big ideas, the enduring understandings, and the science practices. So let's just look at the big ideas for the AP biology course, because then I think this will help you kind of get a sense of what we mean by a big idea, right? So first big idea, evolution. The process of evolution drives the diversity and unity of life. The second big idea, cellular processes, energy and communication. Biological systems utilize free energy and molecular building blocks to grow, to reproduce, and to maintain dynamic homeostasis. Big idea 3, genetics and information transfer. So living systems store, retrieve, transmit, and respond to information essential to life's processes. And then the last one, big idea 4, interactions. So biological systems interact, and these systems and their interactions possess complex properties. So this is what we mean by big ideas. If you have your favorite piece of content, if you're a biology teacher and your favorite piece of content doesn't fit into one of these, it's no longer in the AP biology course. And that was the idea. We really wanted to narrow this down around just a few big ideas. Then we unpacked them. We unpacked them into what we called enduring understandings. The idea behind an enduring understanding is, what do you want a student to know in 50 years? Right? So oftentimes, a student will take an AP biology course, and that's the last time they're going to get any biology. So we have kind of a big weight on our shoulders to make sure that whatever they're learning in that course is going to be useful to them, because it could be the last time they're ever going to take any sort of biology. So what is it that we want them to know? Well, let's look. This is the first big idea, was evolution. Here are the 4 components, right? So the change in genetic makeup of a population over time is evolution. Right? I don't know if you guys can all read this. I don't want to have to read everything that's on the screen. But it's this idea of, this is what we want a student to know about evolution in 50 years, right? Not necessarily just the Krebs cycle or something like that. Right? And then finally, the science practices. And the science practices, we completed our project, although the first AP biology exam was given this past year. And chemistry is going to be given this coming year, this school year, and then physics will be the year after. The science practices have gotten kind of a lot of attention lately, mostly because of the next generation science standards and even our own College Board science standards. So let's look and see what some of the differences are. We came up with, for AP biology, 7 science practices. Now these are really no different than the 5 science practices we have in our own science standards, or the 8 science practices that the NGSS came up with. They're just kind of organized slightly differently. And this is, I guess maybe we can talk about this a little bit differently with this group, but this kind of defines the epistemology of science, right? So where each of the big ideas and the enduring understandings are specific to the content domain that we're talking about, either biology, chemistry, physics, these are going to go, this is kind of like the glue between all of them, right? And anything that uses these science practices, we would call science. Anything that does not use these science practices, or we would need to tweak these science practices for, would not be science. So like math. Engineering would fit closely here, right? If you had the Venn diagram, the bubbles would overlap. Some of this would work, but you probably have to tweak some of them as well. And so this is science to us at the college. All right. Now, our task was not just to redesign kind of the framework, but to actually come up with different items. So we did all of this work, which was years worth of work to get to that point where we had well-defined big ideas, enduring understandings that we were very confident with, and science practices that we really liked. But how are we actually going to use that to measure students' knowledge? And I think this is kind of where the heart of our discussion will be for the rest of the time. So we have the 3 components that we discussed before. And I usually pause at this point because I have to apologize to those people who have ever gone through either ECD or any work like this, because I oversimplify it like crazy. And what I do is we take these 3 components and we throw them into, I call this the magic hopper, right? And so the magic hopper spits out a claim, right? And so all you really have to know is we take those 3 components, the big idea, the enduring understanding, and the science practice, and we combine them in some way to come up with a claim. And we're going to look at some of these claims in just a minute. Now, why do we do this? How many people here know evidence-centered design or have heard of evidence-centered design, at least a little bit? Okay. So we used an evidence-centered design model. It's not so important that you understand every aspect of this, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to just look at how we combine those three pieces was the claim, right? And the claim really states the knowledge that you want a student to have. So you want the student to explain something about evolution, you're going to be really specific about what it is. You're going to make a claim about specifically what you want the student to know. Right? Then we have the evidence statement. So then we needed, after we had all of those claims, so we combined those bubbles for each one of our pieces, then we had to write evidence statements for each one of those claims. So what is the evidence that you would accept as either the teacher, the assessment writer for us, or whoever might be doing this, that the student has actually obtained the knowledge that you've outlined here in the claim. And then finally, the task. Now, we're assessment writers, so all we had to do for the task, and I'm kind of tongue-in-cheek to say all we had to do, but all we had to do was write items, right? So if you were the teacher in the class, you might be able to take the evidence framework and then go ahead and write a curriculum or a lab or something else, right? What we did is we used it to write items. So is this clear up to this point? Because now we're going to use this model to kind of look and kind of compare and contrast some older items to some newer items. So if there's questions, we can pause here for just a second. Okay. All right. So what's really so different? Let's look at some old items versus new items, and then we can kind of dig into this a little bit more. So again, I don't want to have to read all of this. Can you guys all see that? This is an item that was released off the 2008 multiple choice test. So this actually showed up on the 2008 AP biology test. There's some biologists in the room, I think, right? Does anybody want to offer a possible answer?
3 or 4.
I'm sorry?
3 or 4.
3 or 4. Which one?
Well, that's what we mean by begin.
Ah, good. Okay. There is an actual answer here that we would have accepted on the test. So, now, keep this in your mind for just a second, because I think what would be most appropriate. Going outside of I think what would be most appropriate actually is if you just keep this in your mind for just a second, because with this group, it might be best to just jump into the newer item type, and then we can kind of talk about the compare and contrast between this one and the old one. So remember this if you can for just a minute. What we're going to do is we're going to look at that same model that I had just a minute ago with the magic hopper, and now I've actually filled in the bubbles. So we're going to look at big idea 2, which is biological systems utilize free energy and molecular building blocks to grow, to reproduce, and to maintain dynamic homeostasis. We're going to talk about science practice 1.4. Don't worry about the coding here, but what it's asking the student to do is that the student can use representations and models to analyze situations or solve problems qualitatively and quantitatively. We're going to use enduring understanding 2E. Again, don't worry about the coding here. Organisms use feedback mechanisms to regulate growth and reproduction and to maintain dynamic homeostasis. So again, to oversimplify this, we take our 3 components, we throw them into the magic hopper, and out will come a claim based off of those 3 components. And it'll rise up in just a second. You can't see it. So the claim basically says that the student can analyze biological processes involving growth, reproduction, and dynamic homeostasis that include temporal regulation and coordination. So a relatively specific claim. Let's take a look at what the evidence statement for that claim would be. So here's a possible evidence statement for this specific claim. Representations include relevant factors and processes that solve the problem. The problem is about the timing and coordination of organism development. Explanations include explanation includes a claim that relates the representation to the problem and the evidence from the representation's factors and processes that support the claim. Okay? So this is what we would accept as evidence. This one's a little difficult. I kind of use this one first, actually, because it's a little difficult. But let's look now at the task, which would be the item that would relate to this. Again, I don't want to read the whole thing, so I'll let you guys read this, and then I'll give you the answer again. They're not all biology items, by the way. So if you're a chemist or something, just wait a second. It's coming around. So for those of you that are playing along, does anyone want to give a potential answer? So it's the first one. Okay, the answer really doesn't make any difference here. Let's just talk about kind of the similarities and differences between this particular item, which in content, I hope the biologists in the room would agree, is pretty much related, relatively speaking, to the first item that we just looked at. And I can go back in just a second if we want to see the first item again. But let's pause here for just a second and just kind of talk about what are the differences that you see between these two items, and what do you think is being measured in the first one versus this one. Now, I know we looked at the claim and evidence for this one already, but let's kind of dig into this a little. Please.
Right, I mean, the first one was really measuring, in my mind, memorization of the shapes of what those look like. Right?
Right.
So the indentation suggests the beginning of gastrulation. And if you didn't know that very specific point, and if you're not seeing those images and memorizing it in such a way, you wouldn't be able, there's no shot of you answering that item because there's no reasoning required.
Right. Exactly right. Anybody want to add to that?
I agree with that. Also, this one has interpretation of information that you have in the question, so you're given everything that you need to answer it, if you know how to interpret what you're seeing there.
Yeah. Okay, good. So there's some interpretation there, right? Often what I hear about that first question is, if you don't know the word gastrulation, even if you understand the process and you've seen some of that picture before, you can kind of explain it, there's no chance you can get the first one. This one requires some thinking, right? So what you're really measuring on the other one is, do you know a definition? And have you seen that picture before? If you've got those two things, you've got a pretty good shot at answering that first question correctly. The difference is here, even if you've seen this picture before, and you kind of know what most of these words mean, it requires a bit more thinking to actually come up with the right answer here. How about some criticism to this item? People always want to give me criticism about this.
Reading them.
That's right. So one of the things you'll notice is that, and this is not true, in fact, my next example I purposely put in there because it's less wordy than the old question. But oftentimes what you do find is that some of these questions, because we're trying to get at more components in one particular assessment item, it requires a bit more reading. So there is a higher cognitive demand on the reading component. And I think that's a fair criticism. Anything else? I don't want to go on if there's more questions, comments. If you think that this is a good question, don't think that this is a good question.
But I wonder how many people that don't have biology knowledge can actually answer that correctly. I would argue that if you can reason and you understand that these two cells have to talk to each other and touching is key. The only answer that involves touching on some level is A.
Electrical signal.
Or the, okay, I guess
So
that's
they
just
all
some
have
forward,
different
all right, yes, I will,
answers.
yes, sorry, my mind kind of, yeah.
I mean, is there a definition of genetic material too that precludes a protein, which are all formed as a result of DNA coding? RNA coding of DNA? Genetic material, you mean you see specifically, right, when you're saying that?
Yes.
definition? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, that's a fair question, and I'm trying to think about, you know, you're asking the physics guy, the biology stuff. That's the other problem is we always have to talk about AP biology. But I mean, I think it's a fair question, but I don't think that it would trip up too many students. So let's take a look then at another item. So again, this is from the 2010. This was an item that actually appeared on the 2010. This is chemistry. So let's note the fact. First, this is chemistry. Second, this is not a multiple choice question. So now we're talking about a free response type question. So I can't give you the answer by circle. Okay, so on this particular item, right? On this particular item, again, this is an old one, and I use this one purposely because I want to show that the reading demand can still be relatively high. Usually not for multiple choice with the old tests; it kind of flipped around a little bit. But you know, there's still a high cognitive demand there on the reading side. Any comments about this before we look at the new one? We'll look at the new one and then we can kind of compare and contrast it. So again, let's look at a piece of content that would be similar. So I've chosen to look at big idea 2. Chemical and physical properties of materials can be explained by the structure and the arrangement of atoms, ions, molecules, and the forces between them. The science practice that we're going to look at is that students can make claims and predictions about natural phenomena based on scientific theories and models. And then the enduring understanding. Matter can be described by its physical properties. So we're going to take these 3 components, again, into the magic hopper. And out comes our claim. So the claim here is that the student can predict properties of substances based on their chemical formulas and provide explanations of the properties based on particle views. Here's our evidence statement. Claim or prediction is based on a diagram or model that analyzes the physical and chemical characteristics of a model, or excuse me, of a molecule. Here's the new free response question. Okay, so this one is shorter than the first one, reading level-wise. But what about this question? I mean, what do you see as like the main difference between this question and the past free response question in chemistry? Anything that you might know?
So you're asking them how each model is useful for you like if you need to know something about the molecule, how one of these models will help you figure that out.
Sure. So if I'm interpreting what you're saying correctly, right, the focus here is really about using the model and kind of making the determination of which one of these is more useful, whereas the last one, right, was can you draw Lewis dot diagram, right, which, okay, fine, that's a model, but it's not making use of it in any real way. Anything else about this particular item?
You can use reasoning here actually, and even if you don't know much about those models, you can see that one does have electrons in it and others have distance and so on, and kind of surmise.
Absolutely, yeah. So again, it's kind of measuring your thinking about science and your ability to kind of transfer some knowledge that you know to a situation that you might have no idea about, but use it in a way that you can make use of it to answer the problem in some way. I think kind of the comment before about I wonder how many people that are not chemistry people could probably come close to answering this, whereas the last one was really, really easy, right? I mean, if you knew the suffix endings on each one of those, you had the answer right away. And so in some ways you could actually game the last question. You certainly can't game this question, even if you know the suffix doesn't count. So that's the other piece to this particular. All right. So let me just give you a couple of updates, right? Because often I get to this point, and we've kind of compared and contrasted a couple of items, and the question becomes, well, are students able to do, are we seeing like a big difference here on how students are actually performing on the test? So I'm just going to give you very, very quickly what the new structure of the test looks like. So we looked at multiple choice and we looked at free response. For the AP Biology, there's 63 multiple choice and 6 grid-in item questions. That's a new section, and the grid-in item questions, it's where you would actually calculate a number and you grid in 4.23 or something like that, right? And students get about 90 minutes. Students get 90 minutes for that, section 1. And then section 2 is 8 free response questions, 6 short and 2 long. And there's 80 minutes for that, and it's 50% weight for both. So what did the scores look like that we just got back? Well, we're still kind of digging through all of the information. They were just graded a couple of months ago. And those of you that are aware, it's based on a 5-point scale. This is kind of the breakdown. Now, you look at this breakdown, and it looks pretty good, right? I mean, it's a bell curve. Well, we control for that, but okay. But the fact that there's a lot less students this year, right, that got a 5. But there was also less students that got a 1. So everything kind of packed up around the mean. And the spread was much less than what we've seen in years past. Okay, so this is the multiple choice. So in 2012, on the old exam, 63% correct, and this year, 61% correct. Where we actually saw the biggest dip was on those new grid-in item questions, which we weren't too surprised about. Biologists don't like math, and so we asked them to calculate things, and that was by far the worst section, by a lot. So we've talked a little bit about AP students. What about all students, right? Let's look at this kind of from how we can use this model to help inform other ways of assessing. So, and I left the state on it. Imagine that doesn't have an N and a Y. This is a standard from A State, and it's on earth science. It's a middle school earth science standard. You can kind of take a second to just read these two components, and then we'll look at an item that's aligned to this. So pretty straightforward, right? I mean, the major understanding, this is pretty similar to what you would find in most state standards, and there's a performance indicator here which kind of organizes the major understanding knowledge. Here is the Regents item that was aligned to that standard. Now that's a fair question, right? I mean, this is what you see on this is middle school, right? So this is a relatively typical middle school type item. There's nothing surprising about it. I don't want to say there's nothing wrong with it, but there's nothing surprising about it, right? The question is, what are they measuring, right? Are they getting at that major understanding? Like, what is it that they're measuring with this particular item? What's that?
I'm saying that they're making a misconception with that.
Yeah, I was going to say whether they,
Yeah.
whether they hold
Having
the
an
error
error
to.
Yeah.
It's not that they answer.
Yeah. So the fact that there might be something wrong with the question there, or that it might be biased in some way, absolutely. This was on the June 2012 Regents exam. So let's take a look at this is a page from the Next Generation Science Records. I'm sure most of you are familiar or at least have seen the document. This is really hard to read, so don't worry about it because I'm going to take these pieces and I'm going to put them into my little models, right? And so rather than big ideas, they have cross-cutting concepts. Kind of the similar idea here is the cross-cutting concept is based on patterns. The science practice, again, worded differently, but the same idea, is about developing and using models. In fact, the science practice that I showed you in the last example was also the developing and using model example. And the core disciplinary idea is about the universe and the stars. And so now we're looking at the patterns of apparent motion of the sun, the moon, the stars in the sky, can be observed, described, predicted, and explained with models. So the NGSS has already done this part for you, right? They did the hard work of spinning these things around and coming up with what they call a performance expectation. It's the claim, okay? And the performance expectation for this particular piece is to develop and use a model of the Earth, Sun, Moon system to describe the cyclic patterns of lunar phases, eclipses of the Sun and Moon, and seasons. And so this is not what they've done for you. I've kind of gone in and I've decided I'm going to try to write an evidence statement to this claim so that then I can come up with an item. So this is my evidence statement. Analyze a data set and identify patterns of the amount of sunlight at a given location on Earth, not the equator. Patterns identified in the data are used to explain the relationship between the tilt of the axis of Earth and the celestial plane of Earth's orbit. Again, this is for middle school. So let's look at an item that would align to what I've done here. There's actually 5 pieces to this. The 5th one is on the next slide. I couldn't fit it. And it's fair to note that the other one was a multiple choice, and this is obviously not a multiple choice. So it's not apples to oranges, but there is a difference here. So that's fair if you want to make that comment. And then I'm going to flip over to the last question because I think it really ties it all together. So, is this a fair middle school item, do you think? And that's probably the first place to start. I see some head nodding.
I think there's, again, the concern on the reading level.
Okay, right. So this certainly requires quite a bit more reading than that first question, which was 1 sentence and 4 words.
And graphing skills.
And absolutely, and there's some graphing skills. But don't forget, what we're trying to measure in this particular problem, given the science practice, was can you graph, or can you interpret a graph, or create a graph? So that's an important piece to all of this. So in some ways, what you're saying is we're going to get a lot more information from this particular item than the last. Now, fair enough, this is 5 questions, so that's obvious, but you're doing a lot more here. You're requiring them to do a lot more.
So how do you score someone who made a mistake in the first part, wrong graph.
Yeah.
Apparently, with that graph, they're able to interpret it.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. The next step, which I have not done, it would be to come up with the scoring guide for all of this. And if we were to leave this question just as it is, this is not a field tested item or anything. This is just something I threw together myself. But if I was to do this, I'd probably, if it was going to stay in this form, I'd probably build out a rubric to get at each one of these. And then if the student has done something wrong on question 4 here, yeah, in their plot, then I probably would use the incorrect plot to determine, question number 5. So if they've done something wrong here, they would get something, they would get points off. But if they then used this correctly for the next one, they would still get credit.
Chris, I'm not sure I understand this here. What's the difference between 2 and 3? What's being asked there? And
oh, there's 2 ones here. So
well, right, yeah.
I didn't realize that.
That's okay. But what's the difference there? And couldn't you do 4 to begin to answer those earlier ones?
Yeah, you can. Absolutely. And so part of what I was doing here, I was trying to scaffold an item that you would walk the student through each piece of this. One of the reasons for that is this is a middle school piece, and I was kind of concerned if I jumped straight to plotting something or asking them to interpret this without kind of laying out each one of those steps, I wouldn't be measuring what I wanted to measure. And so I felt as though that it was easier to have them do each one of these pieces so that they could get to this part and not, and I was sure that I was measuring the component. I could see where they're going to drop out. I don't know if does that kind of answer?
A little bit, yeah. I'm just not sure what I'd expect to see in 2 that I wouldn't see in 3. Or that I see in 3 there'll be additional to what's in 2.
It's among the patterns, so I would expect one to be just each of these patterns without any talk about how they relate to each other.
Right, each of the 5.
Right, that's
Yeah.
just each, and then this would be what you see.
Got it.
Okay, exactly. So that's a good point. Maybe I should make that more clear. Again, this is not a field tested item, so that's helpful. Anything else on this particular item? I'm just about out of time. So, if you have any questions or comments, that's my information. I'd be happy to talk with you guys about this. We're actually pulling together a small group of people to write evidence statements to some of our own standards and some other standards, other state standards that are out there to look at what types of tasks can be built, either assessment tasks, curricular tasks, even professional development tasks, if we can find that that's actually appropriate. So if anybody's interested in more of that, just let me know. I'm happy to give you more information or answer any questions that we didn't get to here. And I think I've got another 15 minutes or so for questions, 10, 15 minutes, something like that. I'm a little over, so.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Questions?
Yeah, you had shown us the multiple choice percentages for the old and the new item.
Yeah.
For the tests. Did the instruction within the class, within the AP prep class, did that change between the two? Like, were the teachers given, this is our new emphasis, this is how you teach it?
Absolutely. So if you go online to the College Board website, to the AP website, you'll notice that there's new frameworks for each one of the courses. And the main reason, I had mentioned before that we're kind of doing this soft rollout, right? So biology was last year, chemistry is this year, physics is next year. The reason for that rollout is that we really wanted to be able to provide teachers with time and the help and all of the information that they needed to see what these changes were going to be. Because as I go through this, I don't know how many other people here were AP teachers at some point in their life, but when I look at the two frameworks side by side, the physics, which is what I had taught, if I'm not digging into it very carefully, it's the same thing. I could keep doing what I've been doing, right? Like, okay, so I don't cover this topic anymore, and I have to place a little bit more emphasis on kinematics or something. No problem, I can do that. But that's not true at all. As soon as you start to dig into this, you begin to realize, oh, wow, there are specific components here that you really need to get at. And for example, the biology group, I think that they really need to place a lot more emphasis on the practices that are dealing with quantitative reasoning, because that's what came out of our last test. Is that that's where the students were fell short. And so, absolutely, the teachers are completely aware of this. We're continuing to work with them through all of our professional development conferences that we offer, through a lot of the third-party providers that we work with, and even the textbook companies have kind of started to change a lot of the material that they have there as well.
Dr. Quinn was here talking about the next-gen science standards about a month ago, and I asked a similar question because as a former physics teacher, that I see, just like you said, quantitative analysis, those 7 standards that you showed, 4 of them are heavily mathematical. One was purely mathematical, use mathematics appropriately.
Right.
There still seems to be a really large divide between people who are math educators and applying applied math onto science for real problem solving. And I mean, and science seems to be a logic structure. You know, you said yes or no, and why, and if-then statements, et cetera, which is inherently mathematical when you talk about science or the world. So where are we going with the math transfer? How are these science standards helping more of that mathematics education transfer to kind of enter the science classroom, or vice versa, the science to enter the math? Because I remember putting the y axis and calling it x for a physics student, and that was not allowed. You cannot put x on the y-axis, you know.
It's a great question. I'm interested to hear what Dr. Quinn said about that. But
I said it's like 25 years away.
Yeah. Okay. So good. We're on the same page with that actually, because I think that you know, we're working on that. I mean, if you look, there's math in a scientific context, right? But that's not necessarily what we're talking about here, right? What we're trying to do is look at how is science a building block, or excuse me, how is math a building block, so that you can get at some of these deeper understandings in science. And so, you know, when I was a physics teacher, I taught in a school where 9th through 12th grade, everyone had to take physics every year. And so my 10th grade class, half of them I was able to do two-dimensional kinematics with, and half of them I would have to teach them trig. And I would give them my crash course in trig, which was just enough to get them to be able to do the physics that they were responsible for doing in my class, and then they would learn, like, you know, real trig at some later point. I would agree that we're still probably 10, 15 years down the road. I think where we can make some progress, though, is on those evidence statements. So if the claim is really getting at modeling, how do we in the scientific community talk about modeling? And what do we want to see? And what do the math people want to see? And where is that overlap? Because the student's perspective is they're going to math class, they're learning about it, then they're coming to science class. We want it to be kind of a coherent storyline. And if it's not a coherent storyline, then that's on us. And so...
That's on the science people? No.
No, I think it's on the education community, right? Like, no, I don't think it's just on one group or the other. I don't think one group owns it, right? I think that's the problem. I think oftentimes the science, you know, as a physics teacher, I can remember many times thinking, like, why do my math colleagues do it like that? Like, I'll teach it to you, you know? And I'm sure that they were doing the same thing anytime they came across a, you know, projectile motion problem or something like that in pre-calculus. They're like, do it this way. Like, they don't know what they're doing. And so I think that's, you know, I don't know that I have a good answer. It's a tough question. I should say, when we did this work, we ran a huge survey of college teachers, because don't forget, AP courses are supposed to be the equivalent of a college level course. And so in order to meet that mark, what we wanted to do is we wanted to make sure that we were, you know, being true to what was actually happening at the university level. So we asked teachers, you know, like, what do you do in your courses? So they, you know, responded to this survey. And one of the questions we had in there, because we were going to be writing our own science standards, what do you want your students to come into the class prepared to know? And I'm not joking, the overwhelming response, we surveyed over 1,200 colleges, universities, community colleges around the country. The overwhelming response was, I wish they didn't know any science. Because they come to my class having all these misconceptions, and I spend half the year undoing all those misconceptions, and then I can teach them science. So it would be better if they just had some basic math and some basic ELA. I think we could do a lot better than that, right? And so I'm not answering your question. I'm kind of dancing around it, but you know, that's kind of where we are currently.
A lot of the standard says there are two parts, develop and use. Are you interested in making separate inferences about those? This person knows how to develop but does not know how to use. This person knows how to use but not know how to develop.
Yeah, so those are very different things for us, right? And absolutely, we want to know, can you use that graph, or can you create your own graph, or can you interpret that graph to support some claim that's being made from something that I'm going to ask you? And is that a valid claim that's being made, right? Is it answerable by evidence that we can collect in a scientific way? So the answer is yes. We're very concerned about each one of those pieces, and it's a lot more than just that. And actually, we spent, probably well over a year of the 4 or 5 year development of this whole thing was parsing out, what do we mean by all of these words? And so one thing I'm not showing you, right, because it just doesn't work up here, is we have this whole framework document, which if you want, you can get it offline or email me. I'm happy to send it to you. For each one of the domains, and in the back of that, there's a huge glossary, which is like, a quarter of the overall document that defines everything that we mean by that. And a lot of it is in the practices, because the practices are what's so new for a lot of people.
So you're trying to report multiple scores?
No, not necessarily.
So for item though, if your item is based on a claim that hops everything together, you could potentially you should be able, theoretically, you could tease apart how the student is doing on the practice, how the student is doing on the big idea and the understanding.
Yes, we would never assess one separately. I guess you could assess the content separately. We've been doing that for years. But I would never assess just the practice itself.
Right.
But can we report out on it after we begin to tease it apart? We can, probably, but we haven't done that. And we are not likely to go down that road.
You're going to run into the reliability issue.
Right.
And that's the reason why it's not all this.
Yeah, I don't think we really have any interest in trying to get to that point. If you were thinking about it from a diagnostic perspective, don't forget, the AP exam and a lot of the items that we're working with are for summative purposes. And so if you were thinking about it from either a formative or diagnostic perspective, then you would really want to try to tease some of those pieces apart. But even then, I think it would be more difficult than
But even from
immediately
a
assume.
policy perspective, wouldn't it be useful to see if students were having particular kinds of weaknesses in one area versus another, as ways of thinking about what kind of professional development that can be?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where, if you take the test as a whole and you begin to look at, all right, well, here's the 10 items we're modeling the peers. How are students doing on those 10 items regardless of what the content was? Or, here's everything to do with evolution. How are students doing on that, even though some of it was modeling, some of it was math, some of it was making a claim, supporting a claim, whatever. So, yeah, you can get at that kind of at the macro level, but I don't know that on an item-by-item level we would start to want to tease those pieces.
As a person who participated in the physics stuff and studying it for a long, long time, I want to add that not only that the content was cut, but in physics, a 1-year course became a 2-year course. Mm-hmm. And so now students can take Physics 1, pass the exam, and that would be equivalent to the first semester of the physics course, or the general physics course, and then they can take the second year, and this will be equivalent to the second semester. But that higher ed study that you mentioned, I don't know about chemistry and biology, it was really bad for physics. Bad in a way that when we originally designed the whole thing, it was beautiful. Because the first year was more or less conceptual and exciting and slow pace and development of practices. It's just really great. We go to the physics professors, who are mostly very traditional, and they give multiple choice exams to the students, 700, 500 students in the course. They don't develop any scientific practices, and they don't care about them. They say they do, but they don't assess them, and they don't develop them. So the courses are very traditional. Chemistry courses, as you know, are extremely traditional. There's nothing about practice. It's just memorize, memorize, memorize. Biology is the same. What they said is that certain topics that they cover, and they literally cover, in a way, understand by design, talks about it, literally covers students don't learn that, but they're mentioned in the syllabus. We had to put them. So these things that are completely anti-developmental for the students and very hard to understand, and we put them in the second year course. They made us move them to the first year course. So it is when, I understand that College Board wants college professors to accept this as a substitution for their general courses. But in fact, if these courses work, they will be so much better than 99% of college of general, bio, general chemistry, and general physics. And hopefully they will, the same way as the next generation's science careers, that they will drive college professors to change. But in this particular case, the effect of higher education was so negative. I mean, they couldn't change it a lot, but what they added was anti the spirit of the reform.
And I think there needs to be a lot of educating done on part of educators with scientists. That relationship is not,
Yeah,
the best one out there.
Right. So I think, and so what happened is the good thing got worse because of people who didn't understand the goodness of it. Instead of taking the good ideas and making the higher ed professors change. I understand it's like impossible, but I want you to understand that it's not that simple to reform the AT courses, because the college professors have to approve and say, yes, that's what we do. And we don't want to do what they do.
So
On average.
it's a really good comment, and part of the storyline, I guess, that I'm leaving out, that report that I showed at like slide 2 or whatever, that was written by the NRC. There was a guy there by the name of Jay Laboff, who was the lead on that particular report. And he's still with the National Academies. And he wants to do the same thing that you're talking about. And he often uses what we've done in the AP redesign to talk to college professors. And the way that he kind of pitches this is, what you've been doing for the past 20, 30 years is not going to be okay in, 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 years from now, because students are going to come in expecting, and first of all, knowing a lot more, hopefully. And second, kind of expecting something different than sitting in their seat and, with 500 other kids looking at someone, 30 yards away talking about science, right? They're going to expect that they're going to be participating in this and actually engaging in it in some way. Otherwise, they're going to get tuned out. The other part that we're always constantly fighting is there's the will and the skill components, right? So we want to create a course that not just prepares a kid cognitively to get into that next level, but also kind of engages them and makes them want to go to that next level, right? I remember when I was a physics teacher, there were a few other physics teachers in the building that were really, really good at the skill component, right? Like you could drill those kids all day long and they could solve projectile motion problems and all that, but they did not want to go to physics class and couldn't wait to be done with it. And it's like, well, come on, we've got to, there has to be that balance between the two. So that's kind of the only other piece I would add.
Okay, well,
There's one more. Sorry.
That earth science task is got me as an earth science teacher.
Okay.
That's a long task.
It is.
And it doesn't really cover a whole lot of the curriculum. And even if there's a kid who, let's say not only in 8th grade, but at 8 years old, could recite to you the eclipses, the equinoxes, the dates, and everything else, and now is stuck looking at this data trying to create a graph, and that's a long task.
It is.
I mean, that might be, a unit test for a middle schooler on that particular section of the curriculum.
Well, don't forget the amount of information that let's assume that we took that task. We field tested and we actually went ahead and we put it into something like the Regents exam or something, right? The amount of information that you're going to collect off of that one task is going to be 10 times what you're going to collect off of any other one multiple choice or even free response, right? And so by doing that, what I would argue is you can shorten the rest of the test, right? So if all you have is 90 minutes and that task is going to take 20 minutes, well then take out 15 other questions that you don't need anymore because that's actually going to start to cover it, right? And I don't want to pick on New York here, my home state, but but if you look at their standards, they actually have the content in one area, and then you flip to like a whole other section, and they have the practices over here. Right, and then what they try to do when they assess these things is they try to do it separately, and it never works out, and so it's a big mess. And really, you can get to the content stuff, like that question that I put up there, and you could have kids fire those things off every 30 seconds, right? Like, it's not such a big deal. But once you get to the practice side, it's really hard. I would argue that if we were to, I'm not saying that that's the item to use, but if you were to move more in that direction on the spectrum, you would be able to remove 3/4 of all the items that are currently there and get a lot more information.
I agree, and the short answers that New York has gone to on the regions are way more about content than they are about thinking, which didn't used to be on those regions exam short answer questions. But then you
Part of
got
it is also depending on the content.
It is, right. It's also narrowing it down to what is it that you want them to know, right? Like, it's great that kids know what a solar eclipse is, but do they have to know like every aspect of it? Like, it happens every 2 years, and like they don't need to know all. Like, they need to know like what it is and how to model.
well, and why it happens.
And why it happens.
Again, because going back to those very concepts, right? These are cyclical patterns. They happen at regular intervals.
Right.
Right. And those are like the big things that you want them to understand.
Right.
These are still assumed to be paper and pencil tests?
Yes. Currently, all paper and pencil.
So that limits the kinds of things you might be able to do.
It does. It limits some of the things that we would be able to do, and that also means that they're not it's not adaptive or anything like that. So it's you get this item, you get it right, you get it wrong, doesn't make a difference. The next item is the next item. So yeah, and that's for this foreseeable future. That will be the case.
What happened to the last then?
The lab
component.
So the lab components are still there. The biology, it went from the dirty dozen to now it's 13 labs. And the College Board just requires that you do the labs, and we don't tell you what labs you have to do. So again, the way in which we kind of run the course and exam is we run the exam, and teachers kind of submit a syllabus at some point, and then we kind of give them the blessing that they can go forward and call it an AP course. But beyond that, we don't really tell them what to teach or how to teach or what content they have to cover. We tell them that they have to do 13 labs for AP Biology, and we give them suggestions. Here's 13 perfectly good labs. You can use these straight from the book. Or if you want, you can do 13 of your own labs. Or if you want, you can adapt these in any way that you want, as long as you do 13 labs. So there is a lab component.
Okay, well, thank you very much.